We're coming to the conclusion of the writings corpus, and we now come to the book of Ezra Nehemiah. So we say Ezra Nehemiah because in the Hebrew corpus, it's actually just one book, Ezra Nehemiah. We split those two books up right in the English canon, but originally Ezra Nehemiah. And I love this background here, the title slide, because you can see on the left that's supposed to be Ezra in his reading of the law, and on the right, this I just find this cool picture, medieval art of of people attacking Nehemiah's wall. Let's go ahead and get started in our overview of Ezra Nehemiah. All right. So, let me go back. Sorry, I jumped the gun a little bit. All right. So, I did this with the book of Daniel, and I want to do this with the book of Ezra and Nehemiah as well. Because the Old Testament covers so much time, and so it's just helpful to get some type of historical chronological bearings. So, first, Ezra and Nehemiah begins 538 BC. So this is about 50 years after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. And it begins with Cyrus, king of Persia, permitting the exiles to return to Jerusalem, and concludes with Nehemiah's final reforms as governor of Jerusalem. You can see here Roman numeral 2. In 538, so again, it begins 538, all right, here. Around this time, Cyrus conquered Babylon and thus assumed authority over the Jews whom the Babylonians had exiled to Babylon. So just like there's things going on in Israel, Jerusalem at this time, right? There's different things taking place in the ancient Near East, right? Just like, hey, we live in America today, but there's things at this present moment taking place throughout the world. And so in 538, around this time roughly, what you had was Persia coming onto the scene, and Persia is going to remain a dominant player, right? The book of Esther takes place during the Persian period as well. And the Persians defeat the Babylonians. And with that, they then permit the Israelites to return to their homeland. Now, you can see on the right hand side, I have a picture here. And this right here, I believe it's in London, museum in London. This right here, that little thing, is called Cyrus's cylinder. And that is in Akkadian cuneiform. And it is Cyrus's, basically his letter that it permits the Jews to return. Now, I believe the letter addresses or the cylinder addresses more than just the Israelites being permitted to return to their homeland. But it does explicitly state that the Jews were permitted to return to Palestine on this cylinder, which is quite remarkable. It's obviously not very big. And so, again, kind of big picture chronology. 538, Cyrus's decree. You can see the picture to the right there, permitting the Jews to return. 516, the new temple is built specifically under the direction of Zerubbabel and Haggai. And then we see in 458, this is when Ezra returns to Jerusalem, and then about 14 years later, Nehemiah becomes governor. So there's a lot going on in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, right? That means it covers a pretty good amount of time. It's covering world events. There's just a lot going on in this really important book. So, all right, let's go ahead and do an overview here. So, Ezra and Nehemiah, it records Cyrus. Again, he's the king of Persia who defeats Babylon and takes over really headship of the ancient Near East. His permitting the Jews to return to their homeland, the rebuilding of the temple, and then Ezra the priest and Nehemiah the governors tasked to rebuild the people and city. So you can think about this. After Babylon in 586 destroys Jerusalem, by this time, Jerusalem already had a mass deportation in 605, 596, and then is completely destroyed in 586. So while there's debate about this, there's probably still like some people left in the land. Whatever is left is not what it used to be. So it is the responsibility of Ezra and Nehemiah and others like Zerubbabel. There's Haggai, who's a prophet during this time, Zechariah. Their responsibility is to, rebuild the city, but also to rebuild the people, in a sense, spiritually rebuild the people. So we can see here there's a discernible flow here. Ezra 1 through 6 focuses on the temple. Ezra 7 through 10 focuses on Ezra building the people spiritually through the law. Nehemiah 1 through 7 focuses on Nehemiah building the wall and establishing government. And then the book ultimately concludes with Ezra and Nehemiah together building the people up into covenantally faithful people. So that's a broad overview of this book. All right, takeaways. What are some takeaways here? So Ezra and Nehemiah reinforces that Yahweh is faithful to his promises. So we see here, this is the book of Jeremiah, which we've talked about already. And again, Jeremiah prophesied right before Jerusalem was destroyed. He prophesied that Jerusalem would be destroyed, and like right up into the cusp of the final days. And Jeremiah says in verse 12, Jeremiah 25, after 7 years are completed, so the Lord says you'll be there for 7 years, I will punish the king of Babylon and this nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity, declares the Lord, making the land an everlasting waste. I will bring upon that land all the words that I have uttered against it. Everything written in this book, which Jeremiah prophesied against the nations. So the Lord says in Jeremiah 25, I'm going to send my people into exile for 70 years. And we've discussed this already, especially as we consider the book of Kings. Kings is very clear. The people go into exile because of their own sin, their own idolatry. But then the Lord says, I'm going to punish Babylon because of their iniquity. And that's exactly what we see in Ezra. And is not only the Lord bringing to pass that he destroyed the Babylonians, but then after those 70 years, the Lord brings his people back into the land. And that's exactly what Ezra and Nehemiah reinforces. Yahweh is faithful to his promise to bring the people back into the land, but then also to destroy Babylon. Absolutely remarkable. And that leads us to a second takeaway here. Ezra and Nehemiah reinforces that God's people must pursue covenantal faithfulness. When the people went into Babylon, they became, in a sense, like the Babylonians. And so now that they're going back into the land, Ezra, Nehemiah, they have a lot of work to do to try to reform these people because of their time in a pagan land. So this is what we see in Nehemiah 9. Now, on the 24th day of this month, the people of Israel were assembled with fasting and in sackcloth. So they're like repenting externally. And with earth on their heads, they put dirt on their heads. And the Israelites separated themselves from all foreigners and stood and confessed their sins and iniquities of their fathers. And they stood up in their place and read from the book of the law the Lord their God for a quarter of the day. For another quarter of it, they made confession and worshiped the Lord their God. So, in Nehemiah, we see here, these people, in a sense, they're like, to use a silly analogy, they're like snakes shedding that old skin as they become new, in a sense. And that's what we have here in Nehemiah. The people are repenting of their sin, they're shedding the old skin, and they are reorienting themselves around the book of the law, the Old Testament. And in doing so, they're praying, confessing, and worshiping the Lord their God. So just as the Lord is faithful to his promises, the people also must pursue faithfulness to their God. Ezra and Nehemiah. It's a great book. And I did not include anything on the book of Chronicles. I just wanted to say, though, so Chronicles is very similar to Kings, although it records, doesn't really say anything about the northern kingdom. It focuses solely on the southern kingdom and specifically focuses on the line of David. But I just wanted to mention that note, not including much about Chronicles because it is very similar to Kings, but only focuses on the southern kingdom and specifically how, really on King David himself. So that brings us to the conclusion of our time in the writings.